In the first book of Samuel, chapter 25, we read of a woman by name Abigail, a name which is relatively unknown and hidden, but which richly deserves a place in any honor roll of peacemakers. Her life is certainly highly inspirational and challenging too. Samuel, the prophet, had just died while Saul was still the king of Israel, and all Israel assembled to mourn for him. After burying Samuel, David and his men set off and went down into the wilderness of Paran, as we read in the first book of Samuel, chapter 25, verse 1. Now there was a very wealthy businessman in Maon, owning 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. His name was Nabal, which meant, according to Bible, fool. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Abigail, the wife of Nabal, possessed several qualities which are seldom attributed to women in our patriarchal culture. The Bible describes Abigail as being an intelligent, prudent, and beautiful woman, and throughout her story we are left in no doubt about her high mental caliber. She is described as an intelligent, prudent, and beautiful woman. But Nabal was hard-hearted, very wicked, and miserly, and mean in his dealings, as verse 3 says. Young women of Abigail's day did not have the luxury of choosing a mate. Her father probably chose Nabal for his beautiful daughter because of his wealth and property. But no amount of riches can replace kindness, respect, or appreciation from a spouse. However, Abigail remained faithful to Nabal and served him well. Her domestic domain ran like a well-oiled machine. I am sure the servants also loved her. God's word tells us in chapter 25, verse 16, that David and his 600 men had shown great kindness to Nabal and his workers. Night and day they were like a rampart to us. All the time we were with them, minding the sheep. They had protected them while the servants were caring for their sheep out in the desert, and were faithful, not taking anything away from them. Thus, David's servants took care of the sheep of Nabal, and they did a favor to Nabal and his servants. At a time when dangers lurked all around in the desert, this was a huge blessing from David to Nabal and his family. Their protection gave Nabal and his shepherds the ability to complete their work and prosper in their business dealings. Now David sent a word of kindness to Nabal, asking Nabal for a favor. A simple act of hospitality from him and his servants which was common in their culture then. Since David and his people helped Nabal and his shepherds and protected his sheep, now David needed a favor, so he is sending men asking Nabal to do this simple favor. But Nabal answered David's servants. As we read in chapter 25 verses 10 and 11. Nabal answered David's servants when they came to ask him for a favor. Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where? Everybody knew who David was. He was a fierce, famous warrior. But Nabal called David a slave, when in reality he was King Saul's son-in-law. How insulting! How foolish! Imagine David's anger when this hard-hearted man had responded rudely and with such contempt. It was there the conflict began between David and Nabal. David said to his men, "Put on your swords." So they put on their swords and David put on his. Verse 13 says, about 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. Nabal's servants must have immediately feared for their lives. And one of those servants knew exactly where to run for help, to Nabal's wife Abigail. Her male servant, worried about the outcome of Nabal's foolish and rude treatment of David's men, took his concern to Abigail. He said to Abigail, "David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, but nothing was missing. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." Her servants were possibly in the habit of going to Abigail for advice, as her husband was a confirmed fool. Having heard what transpired between Nabal and the servants of David, Abigail loaded up a feast of wine, fruits, and bread and went riding her donkey to meet David. She had hoped that her action would calm David and spare her family from death. She took control of the situation that was potentially dangerous for them all. She didn't just sit around and blame her husband or remain stuck in fear, in helplessness. Instead of hiding or covering, Abigail moved forward, knowing that God was surely with her. She sent her servants ahead of her with food, And verse 19 says, she chose wisely to act alone without telling her husband. Abigail chose wisely to act alone without even telling her husband Nabal. Here we see that as soon as she obtained the facts from her servant, Abigail swiftly sized up the situation, anticipating correctly David's next move, and acted before David and his men could carry out their violent plans. As we read in the verses 23 and 24, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "My Lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please, let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. My Lord, do not take seriously this ill-natured fellow Nabal. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent asking for a favor." Abigail had a thorough knowledge of God's promises to David, of David's royal destiny, and of Jewish law, which treated murder and acts of revenge as serious crimes. This was where Abigail displayed her gift of diplomacy. She reminded David that when he became king, he would not want to have these needless crimes on his conscience. She reminded David that when he became king, he would not want to have these needless crimes on his conscience. It was this argument which convinced David to stay his hand against Nabal. Abigail's behavior negates the traditional idea that women are habitual detherers and poor decision makers. This was the traditional idea Abigail negates. Similarly, we remember the two Hebrew girls, Shipra and Puah, in Exodus. They also proved the same by taking firm decision, negating the order of the Pharaoh fearlessly. Abigail had the courage and strength to shoulder the blame for something she didn't do. She begged forgiveness on behalf of her entire household. And God used that moment to show David how wrong it would be to take revenge in his own way and kill those innocent servants. This was the peak moment for Abigail, because she had no idea how David would respond. But still, she chose to do the right thing. She looked beyond herself. She acted with humility and compassion. In this context, we understand that humility is not weakness, and compassion is not a soft skill. Abigail sought to make peace with the very one her own husband had angered. She asked for a chance to speak and right the wrong. This is Abigail's moral strength. As we read in verses 28 and 29, please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. Abigail carefully thought out each and every word, as she was sure her words and actions had the power to pacify David. She knew that bigger picture of this story was much more significant than that one moment. So she reminded David how important it was that God was building greatness in his life, that the Lord himself was fighting for David. She had obviously heard of David's stories, that David had used a sling to kill a giant, that Saul was pursuing his life and spoke in such a way to bring him back to God's larger picture. All through David's life, God fought for him, his beloved, and that very God was fighting for Abigail too. Chapter 25 verses 30 and 31 say, "When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him leader over Israel, my master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenging himself. And when the Lord has brought my master's success, remember your servant." A deeply spiritual woman, Abigail, she knew how to connect with the man David, who was after God's own heart. Abigail reminded David that God was his strength and his destiny was to be a king. She appealed to David to keep himself pure by showing mercy instead of vengeance. Abigail is appealing to David to keep himself pure by showing mercy instead of vengeance. Wow, what a lady! Abigail fought to protect her husband and her household. She was not thinking only of herself, but of all those as she loved everybody. She was loyal and honored God and her family in all she did. She chose to show great respect towards David, reminding him that God would bless him and bring to his life every good thing that he had already promised. God would bless David and bring to his life every good thing that God had already promised. And with wisdom and discernment, she asked David for only one thing at the end of her plea, that when God brought him success, he would remember her. Abigail was incredibly faithful in her words, her actions, and in her demonstration of love for the servants. She knew that if she could win David's favor in that situation, her workers and family would be spared. The element of surprise worked in her favor. She caught David completely off guard, easily holding his attention with her persuasiveness. It was her quick thinking and timely diplomacy which prevented David from exterminating all her menfolk in retaliation for her husband Nabal's foolishness. Abigail's quick thinking and timely diplomacy saved everybody. Abigail's plea to David, full of good sense and forceful reasoning, completely won him over. David not only accepted her counsel, but was also moved to thank God for her understanding. It was only after Abigail pointed it out to David that he was able to realize that his plan of action, murder and revenge, was needless. David said to her, as verses 33 to 35 we read, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to meet me today. Blessed be your good sense, and blessed be you who have kept me today from blood guilt and from avenging myself by my own hand. Go home in peace. Yes, I have heeded your voice and I have granted your petition." David agreed to spare the family for Abigail's sake. As God worked through Abigail and spared the lives of her entire household, she used timely wisdom in telling Nabal what had happened. Because of his drunkenness that evening, she waited till daybreak to share the whole story. And the Bible says in verses 37 and 38, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him. He became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. The stingy Nabal died, presumably of shock over his wife's generosity to David and his men. God took care of Abigail, and the story goes on to say that when David learned that Nabal had died, he sent word to Abigail of his proposal of marriage to her, which she accepted in her usual decisive manner. David showed honor to Abigail by taking care of her, and the Lord faithfully provided for her and all her household because of the courage and wisdom she portrayed. What can we learn from Abigail's life? Number 1. Through her good judgment, and choosing to act humbly and bravely. God Himself showed strongly on her behalf, preventing David from going to battle and rescuing Abigail and her servants from the evil of Nabal. Number 2. In an age when women were looked upon as mere chattel and weak, expected to be totally dependent upon their husbands, Abigail thought and acted as a very independent person. In fact, she bypassed her husband, taking upon herself the entire responsibility for the foolishness of her husband Nabal. Number 3. To achieve her objective, the prevention of bloodshed, Abigail risked her own life, humbled herself before David, and appeased his wrath by falling at his feet and by offering him gifts. She exercised diplomacy of a high order. Today, we live amidst strife and hatred, but Abigail, riding on a donkey, can show us the way in our quest for peace and goodwill. Abigail was surely a bold peacemaker. Often in life, it's not the easiest of times, but the hardest that can bring out the best in people. Abigail's life was a powerful reflection of this very truth. Instead of wallowing in self-pity and defeat over her circumstances, she acted courageously and used great wisdom when faced with a threatening scenario. She realized that David was a holy man and what his God was capable of. She avoided unnecessary conflict and bloodshed. She worked quietly to resolve the problem. She put her understanding into action and changed David's mind. Finally, God fought for Abigail, just as He so faithfully fights for us to this day. He did not leave her on her own, but gave her great favor in the sight of David. Often when we are faced with difficult situations or hard struggles, we may feel like we have been left on our own. But God is always with us, leading us with His spirit of wisdom and discernment, pouring out His strength and grace, reminding us that He is the greatest power propelling us onward. In short, Abigail is teaching us, don't let fear hold you back. Move forward in God's courage and wisdom. Be humble and kind. Seek peace with those around you, avoiding unnecessary conflicts. Our words and actions are powerful. Look to the bigger picture. There, humility and compassion come to our aid. A true warrior is loyal and faithful, thinking of others before themselves. Yes, remember, God will fight for you. You are never alone. God will do all the fighting for you in your struggles and conflicts. You are never alone. Act using your God-given ability and bring reconciliation among people. For your personal reflection, number 1. Do you admire Abigail? Why? Have you met women who have resolved conflicts in families and communities? How have they done so? Number 2. Do you find yourself repeating positive stories about other women? How can you develop positive habit? Thank you, my dear friends. God bless you.